Texas is a big place, but in the little town of St. Anthony is the even smaller St. Anthony of Valero Mission, and only 2 buildings are left of the original 3-acre site. I'm sure you've heard the saying, don't forget the Alamo. Okay, so how much do you remember about it? Is it how it looks? Hope not, because that's not original. What about where it was built? Because that's not where they first set up the mission either. What about who was there? That's not a simple answer either. Let's instead get a bit closer and look at those questions and also what people don't really think about. Why has the Alamo survived? This is the smaller picture. What we refer to as the Alamo, or in Spanish, El Alamo, was originally named after this guy, Baltazar de Zuniga y Guzman, who was the first Duke of Arion and second Marquess of Valero, and that's because he gave approval to this guy, Father Antonio de San Buenaventura y Olivares, to move an existing mission from near the Rio Grande to basically where it is now. For those that don't know, this kind of mission was essentially a base for evangelical Catholic priests to convert the locals. Nearby, in this case, was the San Antonio de Bayar military post, which, well, was meant to protect the town locals and the missionaries while they were doing the converting. Now, what is absolutely not at all surprising for the Texas coast, a hurricane in 1724, well, destroyed most of their buildings, so the missionaries said, screw that, we're moving, and moved to where it is now. As mentioned before, only 2 buildings are left. The Long Barrack, often referred to with an S at the end, and the chapel, which is never, ever referred to with an S at the end. The Long Barrack was originally built as a convent, the living quarters, and the chapel was originally built to not fall down, but it did in the late 1750s. In 1758, the rebuild began, and along with it, the walls that surrounded almost all of the mission. In a stroke of good luck, the second chapel stayed upright, so there was no need to build a third chapel on top of it.
I built a second one. That sank into the swamp. So I built a third one.
The chapel and its distinctive shape is what most people think of as the Alamo, but as we'll get to later, that's not at all how it originally looked. It's not even how the builders considered it was going to look. The 1758 rebuild of the fallen down chapel was originally planned to have a 3rd story and bell towers. No clue as to what the first chapel looked like, though. Here's a picture of Mission Concepcion in San Antonio. It's not the same, but it's an idea of what the Alamo's chapel could have looked like with the bell towers and the 3 stories. 34 years after the rebuild, the mission was secularized and then abandoned due to the low number of native tribe members that weren't exactly willing to get with the party and convert to Catholicism. Soon after that, the missionaries went out for a cigarette and never came back home, but a Spanish cavalry company decided to occupy the mission. Those soldiers were from the community of Alamo de Parras in Mexico, and that's where we get the name. In 1828, one of the worst things to happen to the site occurred. A Frenchman showed up. Naturalist Jean-Louis Berlandier stopped by, took a bit to observe the site, did some drawings, and stated that the mission, quote, could pass for one of the loveliest monuments of the area, even if its architecture is overloaded with ornamentation like all of the ecclesiastical buildings of the Spanish colonies. Here's a good photograph to show what the Alamo's ornamentation looked like by at least 1931. Before that, well, definitely a whole lot more, so you can kind of see what Berlandier was talking about. And then in 1836, something happened that wasn't interesting at all, or important, or needing of a discussion, or mentioning. And 10 years after all that hullabaloo, here's what the Alamo looked like after General Santa Anna was captured and the Mexican troops retreated and ransacked the place. This is a good representation of what the front looked like after the big fight if you, ignore the overgrowth, the rundown appearance, the lack of doors, lack of fortifications, and the lack of people. Here's another photograph, this one taken in 1836 from a Texian quadcopter. Here's the chapel, and here's the Long Barrack. The chapel's hump was added around 1849 to 1850 by the U.S. Army when it repurposed the site for use as a warehouse by the Quartermaster's Department. Along with that vertical bulge, the Army added something that we in the industry call a roof, But that burned down in 1861, so a new one was built. In 1876, the U.S. Army abandoned the site because Fort Sam Houston was being established nearby. So, what was the Alamo made from? Well, that depends on when. You see, the Alamo has changed hands an obnoxious number of times. The owners and/or occupants of the Alamo have been missionaries of New Spain, Mexico, the townsfolk of Villa de Bayar, Mexican troops, the townsfolk of San Antonio, Texian and Tejano fighters, Mexican troops, Texian troops, the townsfolk of San Antonio again, Texian troops, the townsfolk again, Mexican troops, the townsfolk again, the Republic of Texas, the Roman Catholic Church, a colony of bats, multiple species of weeds and grasses, the U.S. Army, but also still the Catholic Church, and also the city of San Antonio. Nobody was happy about that one, but the Army had the bang sticks and the boom tubes and the pointy sharp things, so The Catholic Church with the U.S. Army renting the chapel, kind of like how the Boy Scouts do. The Confederate Army with an unhappy Catholic Church unable to do anything about it. The U.S. Army with the Catholic Church then taking its ball and going home. Stonecutters. Private individuals, we'll get to that in a moment, a group called the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and then lastly, the State of Texas. And that's not even a 100% complete listing or timeline. Remember how we mentioned that the U.S. Army left the site in 1876? Well, you see, with the site now unoccupied by a government or a government entity, it was free real estate. Kinda. This fella is Hans, and if he was to continue walking to his left, and if he was at that spot just a mere 70 or so years prior, he would have walked right into this behemoth. This is Honora Grenet's wholesale grocery business, which he built on the top of the Long Barrack in the 1870s. In 1883, the mercantile firm Hugo and Schmelzer purchased the building, and also leased the chapel from the Catholic Diocese as a warehouse, so back to it being a warehouse. And this is how the Long Barrack looked prior to the site being sold and the mercantile additions being removed in 1913. Yeah, but what happened that caused the ownership of the site to change hands? Well, that's a bit of its own thing and way beyond the scope of today's smaller picture, but suffice to say it was a huge political mess. Back to what the Alamo is made of. Well, in general, it's made of 4-foot-thick limestone blocks, mined locally, with delicious adobe filling and ornamentation, also mined locally, and at different times the materials list also included wood, plaster, lead, fire, vegetation, concrete, iron, and steel. But what about the other buildings that aren't there anymore? Well, pretty much the same thing, except no lead roofs, no steel, no concrete, and pretty much almost no iron. The survival of the site has a lot to do with government use, private use because of its location in San Antonio, tourism in the area after trains became a thing, and, well, due to municipal advertising of the site. Unfortunately, the buildings have been having some issues for a while now. Ignoring, of course, just how much of the Alamo isn't there anymore, it's pretty darn amazing just how much still is, especially when you take into consideration the number of times that it changed hands and the number of times that people actively went and damaged the site. Even today, the remaining two buildings aren't faring too well. The faces of the limestone blocks are shedding, and it's not just the exterior walls that are exposed to the elements. In a 2016 to 2018 survey, black paper was laid down on the floor at the base of the chapel's interior walls, and separate collection was also done on the exterior walls. But here's the deal. It's estimated that about 250 pounds of limestone flakes and chunks were collected, with about 64 pounds of that coming from the indoor portion during that 2-year study. So back to the question that we asked at the very beginning. Why has the Alamo survived? Well, number one, it mostly hasn't. Remember, it was a 3-acre site, and only 2 buildings are left, and the Long Barrack is half gone. Number 2, well, it's made of big heavy rocks. And then number 3, well, luck. Luck that it was used by people and not just dismantled for its parts, and luck that it became a beloved Texas history site. Preservation efforts and research into the cause of the limestone shedding will continue. As of right now, there's no clear answer or solution. Despite whatever controversies there may be about the 1836 battle and the reasons behind it, the Alamo deserves to be protected. So go out there, visit, donate, and at the very least, in accordance with history, go get some groceries nearby.